Okay, I'm doing this video as a tribute to my son David, who took his life in January of 2024. Maybe it's more for my own benefit. I don't really care if other people see it. And I've chosen not to appear in the video because it's about him, not me. I'm not sure where to start. David was the most unique person I've ever known. And I'm not just saying that because he was my son. David had a way of looking at the world that was just different from other people. His opinions about politics, people, work, just about anything you could imagine were unique. And he would always say things the way they were. There'd be no BS or sugarcoating. He also had a very strong BS meter when it came to what other people were saying. He had no qualms about challenging teachers or other authority figures. I met a guy at David's funeral who was a friend of his, and he told me that he had been shy and didn't have any friends back in middle school. David was his first friend. And he told me that one day when they were about 12 years old, they were in a class together. And David challenged something the teacher had said. And it was right then that he recognized there was something different about David. David, like a lot of boys, started playing video games when he was growing up. When he was about 12, he played games like Minecraft, where you just kind of build stuff. But then when he was 14, he discovered the world of what's called first-person shooter games. And by 15, he had found his game of choice, which was called Counter-Strike. And I asked him why it was his favorite game. And he said it was because it had the highest skill ceiling. Also, in many of the other video games, you play a character, but in Counter-Strike, you are the character. It was about the closest thing to competing in actual sports. David had played a lot of sports when he was young. He played Little League Baseball. His teams even won a couple of championships. He played tennis for several years, and he won a number of tournaments. He actually reached the top 20 in his state for his age bracket. So he already had a competitive nature before he discovered video games. I think he was already 16 years old when he started competing in Counter-Strike leagues, which is quite old. I found out that some kids had been playing the game since they were 10 years old. Anyway, David moved up the ranks pretty quickly, and just before he was 18, he was picked up by a team that was basically one level below professional. I guess I need to digress for a minute to mention a couple of things. The first thing was that David came to my wife and me when he was 17, and he told us that he was going to turn pro. Up to that point, I thought he was just playing the game as a hobby. I didn't even know there was such a thing as as professional gaming, and I didn't know you could make a living doing it. He explained about how much money the pros were making, and my natural reaction was, if there are literally millions of kids worldwide playing the game, what are the odds that you'll make it to the top? And his reply was that it had nothing to do with odds, that if he was smarter, more dedicated, and worked harder, that he would make it. I asked him if he had a backup plan, and he said no. He said that backup plans are for people who don't have belief in their primary plan. He also wanted to drop out of high school to pursue the gaming. And we could have forced him to finish high school, but he was doing poorly anyway, basically because he just wasn't doing the work. And he assured us that if he ever needed a high school diploma, he could get his GED in as little as a week. The second thing was that David had a natural aptitude for the game. He had great reflexes, which are obviously important in gaming. But beyond that, he had an ability to almost visualize the game in his head. David was an actual genius. I don't think he was ever formally tested, but I'll bet his IQ was in the probably approaching 140. He might have been the smartest player to ever play Counter-Strike. Certainly one of the smartest. And he always told me that his greatest ability was to process information. In the game, there's a role called in-game leader, or IGL for short. Very few players wanted the role because it involved extra work, but David gravitated to it immediately. On most teams, the IGL was mechanically the worst player on the team. But on most of David's teams, he was actually the best player. The IGL is sort of a combination quarterback coach, to use a football analogy. The game is a series of 2-minute rounds, 5 versus 5. Half the time you're on offense, the other half you're on defense. And the IGL calls the strategy at the beginning of each round. But he can also make mid-round adjustments as the round progresses. The IGL also does the work of preparing and running the practices, and that's where they typically dry run the strategies to see if they actually work. A lot of the prep work involves watching demos of previous matches to find stuff that works or study the opponent's weaknesses, sort of like a quarterback would watch game film. The other drawback of being an IGL was that it was an underappreciated role. It was usually the so-called star player, the guy who ran around and collected the most kills, who got the most recognition. It was rare for an IGL to make it to pro level on his own. It was usually only if the entire team had success. So David left school and committed himself to the game full time. He continued to improve from ages 18 to 21, but he wasn't really making any money. He traveled to play in some small regional tournaments, but the prize money was barely enough to cover travel expenses. As his 21st birthday was approaching, I told him that he had to start paying rent, and he needed to start making money at the game or find something else to do. At the beginning of 2021, he actually signed a contract with a team that had a sponsor, but it didn't work out. The sponsor had overextended itself and had run out of money. David stayed with them for 6 months, hoping that they would find some new money, some new investors, but it never happened. However, that team did win a couple of events. And he moved to another team in the second half of 2021 that also didn't have a sponsor. And David won several events with that team. There was also a nighttime pickup league that had weekly prizes. So between that and the maybe half dozen events that he won, he made enough to pay rent and have some money left over that he saved. David was always a saver. Other than upgrading his computer equipment, he hardly ever spent money. At the end of 2021, he decided to leave that team because he felt like they had plateaued. The team was mostly older guys, and they were content to just compete at their current level. But David was always striving to improve, and he had ambitions to compete at the highest level. And his teammates were just not willing to do the work to get better. Also, David was not the IGL on that team, so he couldn't have as much impact as he would have liked. He joined a team of younger guys at the beginning of 2022. In hindsight, the players on that team were not as good as he originally had thought, but at least he was the IGL, and he began molding the team to play the way he wanted them to play. They had some success, and they managed to land a sponsor, so David had his first actual salary. Unfortunately, the sponsor dropped them after 6 months, probably due to funding issues. Sponsors running out of money is a common theme in gaming. But the coach knew someone that was involved with the cryptos and NFTs, and he was able to land them as a sponsor for the last 3 months of 2022. And the salary was better than from the first sponsor. At the end of 2022, the sponsor agreed to continue the sponsorship for all of 2023. They even added a monthly incentive if the team qualified for certain events. At that time, the team had a couple of weak link players, so with the higher salary, it enabled them to upgrade the roster. 2023 was David's best year ever from a financial perspective. Between the salary and the incentives and the prize money, he was doing pretty well. However, the problems also started in 2023. In the first half of 2023, the team won some regional events. They also qualified for 2 big tournaments in Europe, one in Dallas and one in Mexico. The one in Mexico was the most important. Typically, there are 2 tournaments a year called majors. They're like a major in golf or tennis. There was only one in 2023 because they were transitioning to a new version of the game. And these tournaments are crowdfunded by fans purchasing virtual stickers. The best teams from North and South America go to Mexico, and the top 5 teams qualify for a spot at the major, which guarantees a huge payout. David's team went to Mexico, and they played on the last day. They had to play a top 10 team in the world, and they lost out in the final game on that final day for the last qualification spot for the major. Typically, a last place finish at the major would be a payout of about $1 million for the team, but it turned out that the crowdfunding was 3 times the normal amount. So if they had won that final game, the players and the coach would have split about $3 million. I always wondered if winning that game would have changed the trajectory of David's career. Obviously, it would have been a huge payday, but David never really cared about the money. Obviously, because of the size of the prize money, making a major was the ultimate goal of most players. At that point, David had won so many regional events or finished runner-up that they were pretty much meaningless to him. He was always looking for continuous improvement. Shortly after he died, I found a notebook in his room, and there was a note that he had written to himself. It said, "You will never get stuck if you keep on working." Anyway, when the team was having all of this success, David was working incredibly hard, an average of about 50 to 60 hours a week. He was not only doing his job, he was doing the coach's job as well. The coach was basically a paycheck stealer, but he had the connection with the sponsor, so he could pretty much get away with it. David was doing the prep work, he was running practice, he was scheduling the scrimmages, he even got involved with their travel plans. And the other players would basically just show up for practice when they were told. They would show up for a match when they were told. They were along for the ride, but David was the ride. None of that success would have happened without all his hard work. And in spite of all this, David was making the same money as everyone else. In June of 2023, he met with the sponsor and he asked for some personal incentives, like getting a bonus if they won tournament matches. He also told them that he was doing the coach's job. In hindsight, that probably wasn't a good thing to say since the coach was friends with the guys who were running the gaming operation for the sponsor. But that's how David was. He always said what was on his mind if he thought he was right. Not only did they refuse his request for the incentives, but they forced him off the team. I don't know if they kicked him out or if it was a mutual parting of the ways. That was never clear to me. There was also another incident that may have contributed to their attitude toward David. Before they went to Mexico, the sponsor asked the players if they wanted to do a boot camp right before the tournament. A boot camp is when a team travels out of town, typically to Europe, to play practice matches before a tournament. The majority of the tournaments are in Europe because the majority of the top teams are in Europe. When you're in Europe, it's easy to find plenty of teams to practice against who aren't in the tournament that you're about to play. But in North America, there aren't very many quality teams to practice against, and it was basically going to be the same teams that they would face in the tournament. So it made no sense to boot camp because you would be revealing your new strategies to the same teams that you were going to face a few days later. For that reason, the players said they didn't want to go, but the coach and the sponsor went behind their back and scheduled one anyway. The other players went along with it because they were too scared to jeopardize their salary, but David refused to go. He participated in the boot camp from home and then flew to Mexico the day before the tournament. Typically in a boot camp, teams play 5 or 6 practice matches a day, but David told me they played about 5 matches total in 5 days. And the funny thing was that David had to schedule the matches. None of the other players or the coach lifted a finger to schedule anything. Once again, it was David deciding to not do something that he thought was stupid and pointless. That's just the way he was. It was more important to him than caving in. And I'm assuming that the sponsor wasn't too happy about that. Anyway, after he left the team in the summer, he sat around for a while. The team picked up an IGL to replace him, and he was a disaster. After 2 months, they released him and they tried to find someone else. But 2 or possibly 3 players turned them down. There was one player on the team who had a reputation for being toxic, and I think that may have been the reason that they had trouble getting anyone to join. They even asked players who were unsalaried at the time and were turned down. That was surprising because there are so few salaried positions available in North America that turning one down seemed unbelievable. Eventually, they invited David back out of desperation, and he accepted. That was in September, I think. However, David refused to come back as the in-game leader because they still wouldn't meet his demands. The toxic player volunteered to be leader, but he didn't really do anything. They almost never practiced, and when they played matches, there was no structure. They just kind of ran around and played like it was a pickup game. They had some success simply because they had more talent than many of the other teams. They were scheduled to play in 2 tournaments in Europe in November, one in Poland and another in Sweden. and the sponsor agreed to pay for a 2-week boot camp in between the two events. With the other guy still leading the team, they didn't win any matches in the Poland tournament. After he returned home, David told me that they were losing every practice match during the boot camp. Right before they were about to fly to Sweden, David told his teammates that he was going to take over as the IGL for the Sweden event. He was just sick of 3 weeks of continuous losing. I doubt if his teammates really cared if they won or lost, as long as they got their paycheck. Anyway, in the first match of the tournament, they upset the number 13 team in the world. In Counter-Strike, there are teams with a lot of money who pay to join as a franchise. I think they pay something like $1 million a year, and in exchange, they get automatic invites to most of the big tournaments, and they also get a cut of the tournament revenue. I believe that in the history of the game, or at least the current iteration of it, no non-franchised North American team had ever beaten a top European team. So winning that match in Sweden was pretty impressive. After they returned from Europe, David talked to his teammates about giving up potential sticker money from future majors in exchange for a higher salary. That's how all the franchise teams operate. They give up about 50% of their potential sticker money in exchange for more salary. David wrote up a proposal and it was accepted, and the sponsor agreed to continue the sponsorship for 2024. They ended up getting their salary doubled. That was in early December 2023. December is a time for player break, so David started to prepare for the qualifier for the next Mexico event, which was scheduled for January. He planned to lead the team for any event that had anything to do with the major, because, as I said, making a major at that point was the only thing that mattered to him anymore. A couple of weeks after the new contract had been approved, he was called into a meeting and told that he and another player were being released. There had been 2 players on another team who were tied up in contracts. The other team's sponsor was hurting for money and was willing to let someone buy out their contracts. Apparently the asking price was $20,000, and it was a package deal, both or neither. David's sponsor knew nothing about it, but I'm guessing that the toxic player on David's team made the sponsor aware of the situation. It also turned out that the toxic teammate was buddies with both of these players, and they frequently played in pickup games together. Also, the other player who was released along with David did not get along with the toxic player. So by cutting David and the other player, everyone got what they wanted. The toxic guy got rid of the player he didn't like. He got a chance to play with his friends. And the sponsor had the perfect opportunity to drop David, who they had clearly never wanted back in the first place. One thing that I always found interesting was that the sponsor couldn't pay David his incentives that he asked for, but somehow they managed to find $20,000 for the contract buyouts. I never understood that. I don't know if David knew what was going on or if it was done behind his back. When he told me what had happened, he seemed to laugh it off as if it was just business. But with the major just a few months away and thinking that his salary was about to double due to his negotiations, I have to believe that he was really pissed off and probably felt betrayed. I firmly believe that David was a top 50 player in the world. In addition to being a brilliant in-game leader, he could have competed on any team at the highest level. For the sponsor to dump him over politics was just the ultimate in stupidity. He contacted another team that same day, and it turned out they had just had a player quit their team and were in need of a player. For them to be able to get David on the roster was like winning the lottery. Talent-wise, they were pretty good, but they were not at the level of David's previous team. Also, they were not salaried. David played with them in the Mexico qualifier in early January, and they were actually successful. They were scheduled to go to Mexico in March. Then they played in a qualifier for a different tournament, and they did very poorly, playing against some really good teams. I don't know for sure, but I think it was at that point that David realized his career was over. He had no salary, he had no immediate prospect of getting a salary, and he probably realized that his current roster wasn't good enough to make a major. Without a salary or sticker money, there was no way to stay in the game. I imagine he was incredibly frustrated. 8 years of total dedication to the game, and then basically to be just left by the side of the road. A week after that last qualifier, he took his life. For other players, gaming was more like a hobby. They just happened to be better at it because of playing so much. For David, it was a career. He was a student of the game, always trying to improve. He put everything he had into it and ended up with nothing other than some savings. I'm convinced that nobody in the game worked harder at it than he did. I think he put in roughly 20,000 hours in those 8 years. You can calculate for yourself how many hours per week that is. It's just speculation on my part, but he may have felt like a failure because he didn't accomplish all of his goals. He may have regretted his decision to pursue gaming or to not have a plan B. Also, his career ended so abruptly that he was probably confused about what to do with the rest of his life. He didn't leave a note, so I'm just left with guessing what his reason was for ending his life. With his intelligence and work ethic, which is a rare combination, he could have done just about anything. He did have a rather cynical view of people and life in general. In gaming, everyone has a gamer tag, and his name was Cynic. I don't think it was a coincidence that he picked that name. When you hear about suicide, there's frequently a long history of depression. I did a lot of reading about depression, and David didn't seem to show the warning signs. If he had them, he kept them well hidden. I heard one suicide expert talk about suicide crisis, which is supposedly a phenomenon that can last just hours or days. I suppose it's possible that David was suddenly overwhelmed with a lot of negative thoughts and just didn't know how to deal with them. After his death, I learned some things about him I hadn't known. A fan signed his obituary page, and he wrote that of all the pro players he had contacted, David was the only one who had signed his profile page. It's funny because David always referred to the fans as a rather clueless bunch. That was the enigma of David. He was cynical about humanity, yet he could relate to individuals. One former teammate from 2021 left a condolence on David's profile page. He had been suffering with some mental health issues, and David helped him by being a good listener. I met David's friends at the funeral. A great group of guys. They thought the world of David. When he was playing in a big event and it was streaming live, they would get together for a watch party. His friends really helped me and my wife get through this difficult year. There were some other personal stories that showed another side of him that I didn't really know. In the gaming world, I'm what was known as a gamer dad. I spent a lot of time following his career. It's probably similar to having a child play professional sports. Not only was I his biggest fan, I also served as a venting mechanism when he got frustrated. He would draw diagrams explaining the nuances of the game. It was a big part of my life for about 5 years. I don't really miss the gaming itself. It was about spending time with my son and being proud of his accomplishments and something that he really enjoyed. There isn't a day that goes by that we don't think of David. Some of our thoughts are selfish, like not getting the chance to be grandparents. I think of the wasted potential, but apparently David didn't see anything that was worth living for. I guess we have to accept his choice and try to live the rest of our lives the best we can. One final thing I wanted to mention. The day after David's death was announced, a player on another team stepped down, citing mental health issues. It could have been a coincidence, but it probably wasn't. I never heard what happened to him, but I hope he received the help he needed. If David's death prevented one other tragedy, there's a small amount of comfort in that. I know we didn't say it enough when he was alive, but we love you, David.